Good evening, everyone. I am Nicola Di Cosmo, the Luz Foundation Professor in East Asian Studies in the School of Historical Studies at the Institute, and I'm very, very pleased to welcome you all at this event. The title of the event is Democracy and Citizenship in China. Is there democracy in China? This is a question that people may find not only difficult to answer, but perhaps even difficult to justify. How can we speak of democracy in China? Yet, it may not be so easy to dismiss this question. Views on what democracy means, and it meant historically, taken broadly, may have to do with a number of other words like demos, people, body politic, which are concepts that have changed historically and have had different currencies in different traditions and in different cultures. When such concepts and several others related to them, like citizenship, participation, representation, are applied cross-culturally across different political traditions, inevitably they require an effort of translation. What do these terms mean when we discuss them in a context such as East Asia? For some time, the meaning of democracy has been discussed in relation to China by various scholars in different contexts, with a number of, shall we say, colorations. Is China a democratic society? Is liberal democracy good for China? What does it mean to be a citizen of and in China today? Perhaps most cogently, how does democracy figure in China's path to modernity? Taking a historical view to a problem means also exercising a critical appreciation of both continuities and ruptures. Here we have today a panel of specialists. They will discuss this theme in a broader perspective and from a number of different angles. Allow me to introduce them in the order in which they will speak. I will just say a few words. There are fuller biographical details on the webpage of the IAS. Lydia H is the Wun Tsun Tam Professor in the Humanities at Columbia University. She has published extensively on political thought, critical translation theory, comparative literatures, digital media, philosophy of language, human rights, modernity, and most recently, AI. She has just published an article called After Turing, How Philosophy Migrated to the AI Lab. I'm happy to say that Lydia was a member in the School of Historical Studies a few years ago. Teemu Ruskola teaches law in East Asian languages and civilizations at the University of Pennsylvania. He is the author of an important book on Chinese, well, on law called Legal Orientalism, China, the United States, and Modern Law, which addressed the question of the status of Chinese law in the US as well as international contexts. Was Chinese law real law? That's the question asked in the book. Teemu continues to work on legal definitions and concepts of sovereignty and citizenship in a Chinese, international, and American legal context. For instance, his current work is a monograph called China, for example, China and the Making of Modern International Law. Teemu was a member both in the School of Social Science and in the School of Historical Studies at the Institute. Wang Hui is Distinguished Professor of Literature and History at Tsinghua University in Beijing and is today an intellectual and an intellectual historian of enormous stature, I would say, and perhaps the most important interpreter of modernity in China. Many of his works have been translated into English, most recently, The Rise of Modern Chinese Thought, that just appeared a few months ago, but also China's 20th century, China from empire to nation state, the politics of imagining Asia, etc. He's the founding director of the Tsinghua Institute for Advanced Study in Humanities and Social Science, and served also as chief editor of the most influential magazine of intellectual inquiry, Dushu, in China. He's, in many ways, a most acute interpreter of the intellectual and political conditions of contemporary China, and also a current member of the School of Historical Studies. Finally, Peter Zaro teaches Chinese history at the University of Connecticut, has been for a long time a research fellow at the Academia Sinica in Taipei, and has written seminal works on modern China's intellectual history, thought, and culture. His latest work is a translation of essays on one of the most important interpreters of Chinese modernity of the who lived in the early 20th century, the political thinker, essayist, and journalist Lian Qichao. The book is called Thoughts from the Ice Drinkers Studio, Essays on China and the World, which was published by Penguin just, again, a few months ago. Peter was also a member in the School of Historical Studies just last year. So to get the ball rolling here, I have prepared a question that I want to ask our speakers to address in any way they wish, which is the following. Over the past 2 centuries, China's progress towards modernity, however we might define it, has been anything but linear. It has also been marked by a series of rigid dichotomies, such as nation-state versus empire, modernity versus tradition, East versus West, state versus individual, etc., often inscribed in a narrative of anti-colonialism, anti-imperialism, and a distinctive Chinese path to socialism, but also to industrialization, economic development, and internationalization. Citizenship and democracy are 2 elements that are being discussed today as a way, possibly, to transcend some of these dichotomies and formulate a different vision for China's future in light of China's distinctive history and past challenges. Based on these premises, this is my question to the panel, how would you define citizenship and democracy in the contemporary Chinese context? Each speaker will have 10 minutes to answer this question, and then we will have another round of shorter interventions, and then we will open it to discussion. So, Lydia.
Thank you, Nicola. It's wonderful to be back here, be part of his vibrant intellectual life this evening for exactly the reasons that Nicola outlined in his opening remarks. I have found it extremely difficult to talk about democracy or citizenship in contemporary China in normative or generalized terms, or even answer a simple question: is there democracy in China? Or do citizens in PRC enjoy the same kinds of rights as citizens as do the liberal people in liberal democracies? The answer tends to be no. But it could be a yes, depending on where we stand across the geopolitical divide. And we all know the divide between the US and China. I'm not a social scientist. I don't rely on objective metrics or subjective standards to look at this problem. Is democracy a set of normative practices in modern politics, such as how a society should be governed and by whom? Does it describe a political process, a set of moral values, a desirable goal, a theory, or a magic mirror that reveals as much as it conceals? As a humanist, my difficulty here has to do with the observer's location or proximity to the object of analysis, or to the questions which cannot but be mediated by historical experience, discursive practices, and also geopolitical conflicts. This is one reason why I cannot provide a simple answer to some of the questions that Nicola raised in the beginning. Nor do I think it helpful if we get bogged down to the ideological battle over ideas. Let me give you an example. In 2021, the Biden administration initiated the first summit for democracy. Within the space of 2 years, they held the second summit amongst the invited leaders of democratic countries to focus on 3 themes: strengthening democracy and countering authoritarianism, fighting corruption, and promoting respect for human rights. Of course, China was not invited and never will be, because it was considered an authoritarian state against which democracies in today's world are defined. Interestingly, however, the State Council of PRC tried to preempt its exclusion by issuing its own white paper ahead of the first summit for democracy titled China, Democracy That Works. Against its reputation of authoritarianism in the West, the official white paper claims, I quote, in a richly diverse world, democracy comes in many forms. China's democracy is thriving along those of other countries, end of quote. They describe the Chinese system as a people's democracy and call it whole process socialist democracy. But outside the political rhetoric of the CPC, few people take their ideas seriously. And in fact, China's proposal of whole process people's democracy is hardly ever discussed in the West. Clearly, the geopolitical dimension to the discourse of democracy makes it even harder to talk about China in those terms. Now, this is not the place, because I'm running out of time, this is not the place to engage with ideological battles over ideas and do justice to it. Instead, I wanted to focus my attention on the space of citizen engagement and citizen activism in contemporary China and show what this space might look like. This angle can help push our thinking of democracy and citizenship in some fruitful directions, I hope. Take feminism in today's China. There are many, many lively discussions of gender discrimination, protests, and litigations surrounding domestic violence and other injustices against women. Have some of the online discussions on gender been censored by the government? Yes, of course. But if we get too hung up on censorship, we'll miss a whole lot of interesting and ordinary spaces of citizen engagement. Let me play a brief video clip about a group of young women on the streets of Beijing, and let's find out what they're doing there. Could Dane please play the video?
Please stand firm, hold the handrail.
promise, Nicola, that it's going to be a very short clip. What you have just watched is a recording of one of the street performances in Beijing, conceived by a Chinese Australian artist named Amy Wu. Wu's project is called a Thunderclap, a work she created during her Artist in Residence program in Beijing in 2017. As you have seen, she uses stenography in fashion accessories, or what she calls subversive decoration, to distribute the writings of a late Qing Chinese anarcho-feminist He Yinzhen. Who was this He Yinzhen? Also known as He Zhen. She was an early anarcho-feminist who figured centrally in the birth of Chinese feminism, along with a few Chinese revolutionaries in exile in Japan in 1907. He Yinzhen co-founded and edited one of the first Chinese language anarcho-feminist journals called Tianyi, or Natural Justice. The journal was absolutely influential in spreading radical ideas such as anarchism, socialism, feminism, and Marxism in the early decade of the Qing dynasty, in the last decade of the Qing dynasty. For example, it published the first Chinese translation of the Communist Manifesto, rendered from Japanese to Chinese in 1908, and introduced Bakunin, Kropotkin, and other radical thinkers into China. In that light, there are three things I wanted to highlight about the space of citizen activism in contemporary China, as revealed by the street performance in the video. Three things: fashion, QR code, and women's movement across the urban space. Now, first, street fashion in Chinese cities is wildly fresh compared to Europe or elsewhere. Ribbons and patches with embroidered letters or fashion accessories that display English letters are commonplace, copied from Western fashion labels such as Machino, Hood by Air, and Supreme. They use black and white English text on clothes as signifier of Western culture. But the English text functions more like a decorative element than text to be read. But for English readers, the texts do appear like a Dada poetry and nonsensical advice. That brings me to my second point, the use of QR codes. In a cashless society, such as China's cities and towns, the use of QR codes saturates the socioeconomic life of ordinary citizens. Like street fashion, QR codes are also ubiquitous, and this is the medium through which He Yinzhen's historical texts are distributed. So when passersby scan the code using their phones, they will be able to download her original Chinese writing. Therefore, the QR code reinserts a radical history or the feminist text of 100 years ago into contemporary political thinking. My final point, which is the third point, that is the space of movement. As we have seen, the young women move across the urban space unimpeded. We follow them to bus stops, subway platform, up and down escalators, as well as red light crossings. They did not encounter obstruction or harassment. As you can see, this is such an ironic picture. Standing right next to this young woman is the traffic patrol there. And they could have meddled into it, but we can talk about that. In her own reflections on her work in the West and in China, Wu says, quote, "Within a Western context, my focus was on alternative interpersonal communication channels against pervasive surveillance. But within the context of Beijing, my focus shifted to exploring steganography as an alternative publishing channel to evade pervasive censorship," end of quote. And I conclude, one gets the sense that surveillance and censorship are ubiquitous. It takes a lot of ingenuity and creative imagination to get around them. The problem is that the Chinese text she distributes through her QR codes isn't censored at all. It is merely forgotten. I know this because when I looked closely, it turns out the edition that she uses is the one I myself edited and published in 2016 with Renmin University Press in Beijing. When I prepared the first annotated edition of this journal, Natural Justice, with my collaborator, Wan Shiguo, we did not encounter any censorship at all. Our 2-volume book was available in bookstores and libraries. So this part of Amy Wu's claim about political censorship is a bit exaggerated. Still, I think her exploration of the space of citizen activism on the streets of Beijing does provide a very refreshing way of looking at contemporary China outside the rhetoric of democracy and autocracy. Thank you.
Hi, everybody, and thank you to Professor Di Cosmo for the introduction. As everybody knows, in the field of Chinese studies, he is the best thing to have come out of Italy since Marco Polo. So I wanted to say that. I'm also excited to be part of this very distinguished group. Let me just jump in. But first, just by way of prefacing, before I discuss some of the reforms that are taking place in China, I actually want to talk about some of the underlying political forms that are being reformed. So that means that my remarks on democracy will be somewhat abstract. Then when I turn to citizenship, I'll be a little more concrete, I hope, and China-focused. I'm not sure if this is what Professor Di Cosmo wanted, but I'm going for a B, at least B+. On democracy. Most of the time, we talk about democracy as if the term were self-defining. We also assume it is self-evidently desirable, doesn't have to be defended or justified. But it is a historical category. It can take very many different forms. It can work relatively well or not in certain historical, social, and political circumstances. And indeed, it is very difficult to separate democracy from the histories of nationalism and capitalism, most notably. But when we talk about democracy today, usually I think we're referring to a political union between liberal democracy and some form of capitalism, namely a system where people vote every few years and elections serve to aggregate individual preferences. What troubles me is that after the end of the Cold War, this particular understanding of democracy has been universalized. In effect, it has become a religion and a very jealous one. It is a monotheistic faith that does not recognize any valid alternatives. Therefore, it is also a missionary project, which aims, I would say, at nothing less than the standardization of political forms and political subjectivities on a global scale. It is premised on a deliberate simplification and oversimplification of the political universe, reducing it to basically two protagonists, the state and the individual. Of course, that was the great achievement of the French Revolution, cleaning up all the feudal clutter of intermediate overlapping lords and sovereigns that once mediated the relationship between the ruler and the subject. Popular sovereignty, however, has left us with a profound contradiction, with the sovereign individual facing the sovereign state. Which one is the sovereign? Domestically, it is the aspiration of liberal constitutionalism to solve that riddle. Internationally, human rights seek to protect the individual if and when constitutions fail, and as all the historians and lawyers here know, they do fail. But of course, there are other forms of democracy as well, such as people's democracy, which isn't necessarily as redundant as it sounds. Instead of taking the individual as its ontological ground, it assigns primacy to the people as a collective subject. So in liberal democracies, politically elected representatives stand in for their constituents. In people's democracies, it is the party that represents the interest of the people. Either way, whenever we are talking about modern centralized states, I think we're always dealing with some kind of representative democracy. And every form of representative democracy entails some kind of distortion, with some people winning and others losing. One senator in the US actually cannot represent the views of 20 million people unless she's schizophrenic, right? Putting aside also even the question how campaign finance distorts the whole electoral process. So my point is simply, there is no pure democracy as such, except maybe a direct democracy on the model of the Athenian polis. And even there, people who are the loudest and the tallest and the best looking will have a disproportionate influence. We call them influencers today, right? And I'm putting aside the exclusion of women as slaves here completely. Let me then also highlight the context of our discussion. Here we are in the Wolfensohn Hall discussing the future of democracy in China at a very moment when we are witnessing its decline in the United States. It is difficult to, in fact, not to succumb to what Wendy Brown of the School of Social Science has called left nostalgia, the yearning for the good old days of the 20th century. But let us not forget, there were a lot of really bad days too. The 20th century was the most lethal ever, witnessing all manner of destruction from multiple genocides to 2 world wars and so on. And yet, the 20th century is also associated with the rise of the welfare state and the expansion of democratic institutions. Sadly, I think this simultaneity of destruction and progress was no paradox. It was precisely because of the innumerable disasters, from the Depression to the World Wars to the Cold War, that the state came to intervene in society in unprecedented ways. Speaking just of the US, right? Integrating the military, bringing women into the workforce, introducing the GI Bill, introducing welfare, investing in education and science, yes, even strengthening voting rights, right? If only to prove the communists wrong. Today, we live supposedly in an era of peace, which means, or used to mean, that there is no land warfare in Europe, right? Well, this relative peace, together with the interminable expansion of markets, has caused the state to recede once more. Today, we see the erosion of pretty much any and every public institution you can think of, which includes the erosion of knowledge, accordingly, the epistemological basis of democracy. So increasingly, profit-driven algorithms have marketized, indeed, I would say democratized, the production and dissemination of knowledge. Yet the production of knowledge is one area where democracy does not work. There are certain areas where some people do know better than others. Okay, enough about democracy. Now let me turn to citizenship and more concretely to China. So conceptually, I would say the idea of socialist citizenship is a very attractive one. Instead of focusing on individual rights, it recognizes the social and economic independence of the people. Here, I think the problem in the Chinese case is there has never been a single People's Republic of China. There have always been at least 2 unequal republics, and probably more. But I'm talking about an urban China and a rural China. When the PRC was established in 1949, it embarked on a program of rapid industrialization. It had very little industry, essentially no access to foreign capital. So it did what Europe had done at an earlier moment, during the enclosure movements, for example. China extracted the resources it needed from the countryside in a process of primitive socialist accumulation. It was the impoverished peasants that came to subsidize the elite workers in urban state-owned enterprises. It was only the latter who enjoyed lifelong job security and a range of cradle-to-grave benefits at the expense of the rural population. Importantly, this wasn't just an economic or social inequality, as it were, but a political one. Based on their household registration, every human being in the PRC was classified legally as either rural or urban. And because your household registration was essentially fixed and inherited, it turned into a kind of caste system where your administrative status determined where you lived, which in turn largely determined your life chances. Because of this regime of geographic apartheid, peasants became literally second-class citizens in their own country. Technically, the household registration system remains in place today, but thanks to economic reforms, peasants are no longer tied to the land. Under a new regime of state capitalism, they are pouring into cities, to sell the only thing they have, their labor power. So paradoxically, I think we're seeing, or at least starting to see, for the first time, a real and growing equality among urban and rural workers. But it is the result of a leveling down rather than a leveling up. Instead of providing the peasants too with the privileges of urban citizenship, the state has abolished the iron rice bowl even for urban industrial workers. As a result, nobody enjoys a system of robust job security and welfare, as rural and urban workers are joined in a single race to the bottom. So in a thin sense, I would say there is finally a kind of universal citizenship, perhaps for the first time, but its substantive content is very diminished, which does make me worry about the potential of citizenship as a kind of emancipatory category in China today, even although there clearly are counterpublics where there may be different forms of democracy and citizenship taking place. Anyway, by way of conclusion, let me return to democracy because I want to be very clear. I'm definitely not opposed to democracy, and I'm definitely not in favor of authoritarianism. But whatever democracy is, and I must confess, I'm not quite sure what it is, I am also concerned about its limits and the ways in which it has become a vehicle for the global standardization of political forms. And more specifically, I am concerned about the way in which the state-individual dyad has colonized our political imaginations. The liberal individual, as many political theorists have observed, is a legal fiction that is actually modeled on the state. It's not a very realistic one. The people as a collective subject does sound more promising, but we have seen that it too is all too easily co-opted by the party or the state or the party state. What is more, at least in its current forms, and there could be more, democracy is poorly equipped to address questions of intergenerational justice. The young and the unborn do not vote. Moreover, it is founded on a profoundly humanist ideology. It has real difficulty attending to the relationship between humans and the rest of the natural world. Famously, as Christopher Stone said, trees have no standing. So yes, I am in favor of improving democratic institutions, liberal and socialist, American and Chinese. But I think we should be careful not to be completely dazzled by democracy. It must not foreclose the possibilities of other kinds of politics and other kinds of institutions globally and locally. Insofar as we are looking for non-liberal forms of justice and politics, maybe China could, even at this point, help us discover some such forms, which is my hope, perhaps utopian one, for contemporary politics in China. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Nicola. At the beginning, I thought it's an easy topic. Then I found it's a so difficult topic. So I followed Timo's talk. I just give you a personal story that more than 30 years ago, after the 1989, I was involved in that moment. So under the investigation, then sent me to the mountain area in the central China, Qingling, Shanluo, poorest area in China. I was shocked by the poverty there, because if you had living in the villages above the 1,800 meter above the sea level, then completely no transportation. It's all depends on the state, the relief project. It's completely. And because without the transportation, most of the marriage happened only within those relatives. More than 0.5% of population in that poor area was mentally ill at that time. So, but just before the pandemic, 2019, actually I revisited the area. I was shocked again, even shocker than that by that poverty, because the huge change for the whole situation, the transportation, for example, from Xi'an, at that time, I took the more than 20 hours from Beijing to Xi'an by train, and then took the bus, very poor bus. To my county, it took the 9 hours. But now it's from Xi'an to my county, the Shanluo, 2 hours. These were really the 2 hours. The whole situation transformed. I thought that the style, the people, young people, the style, not so substantial difference between those deep mountain area and the Xi'an. So that's a huge, important transformation. That, and also the hospital and the school system transformed a lot. The one day, the local leader, the county, my county, came to Beijing. I treat them in a restaurant nearby the Tsinghua University. I asked him about the education situation. Because when I was there, before the 30 years ago, I only came across one student, the university students, graduated from Northwestern University in Xi'an. It's the only one who worked at the government. But so that's why I asked him that how many students you have, the university students. Then he said, look, do you have time? This year, we have 4 students in your university. Tsinghua University, we know that in China is highly competitive. For such a poor country, there were the 4 students from the local schools that was over 30 years ago, over 30 years, the huge transformation. So when we think about the democracy issue, we also need to think about that, for which is the focus on that, how to account for that, the 2 divides, the urban and the rural, poor and the rich, coastal area and the inland area, and all these kind of the transformation. How can we take on that, especially in terms of like T.H. Marshall's idea about the social rights, not only the political rights, but also the social rights. In that sense, these kind of the elevation, the poverty elevation project achieved so much because the millions, the 100 million people out of that kind of poverty. And then in terms of that so-called equality of capability, at least there was the certain stage, the possibility provide them to participate in the social life, in the kind of broad social life. So this when I didn't read my paper, I just hear your talk. I suddenly realized these are my own personal experience and I should say that in 1989, when and together with my colleagues and the students involved in that moment, we simply no idea about what happened in those remote areas. We completely no idea, but we're full of the idea of democracy and so on and so forth, but we simply no idea about what happened in those areas, how uneven that the society and the country is, and how to develop the country politically and socio-economically. So that's why, even that was a punishment for me, but still, for me, it's really educational. I found that I learned a lot from my experience in that period. And here, when we think about that, we also need to rethink about these the contemporary context where we talk about the democracy. We are living in the age of political crisis. One of them was the political crisis. To some extent, it is a kind of the universal crisis of political systems, different forms of that. So it's not only the one single crisis. That's why Nicola said that we need to go beyond that binary framework to think about this issue. But obviously, the issue of democracy is also easily to be put into the framework of the dichotomy, that the democracy, authoritarian, that was very clear. So that I think we need to go beyond that. Still, why have both of these 20th century, let's say that the people's democracy, or in terms of liberal democracy, they saw the authoritarianism and the socialism still, why have both of these 20th century socio-economic systems falling into crisis. And what factors account for the changes in the social character of democracy? What's the different choice in dealing with these challenges in different societies? And synthesize that in numerous discussions of the crisis of political systems, I would suggest the following points, several points here. The one is the intersystemic competition disappeared because the social welfare systems and so on and so forth that happened during the Cold War. There were two systems that competed each other. But that kind of disappeared. The second, the displacement of the manufacturing industries out of Western countries has also driven the industrialization on a grand scale elsewhere, notably in China, where the working class is rapidly expanding. So in a Western society, it's like America, the disappearance of this large-scale working class obviously means a lot for the crisis of the political systems too. But in China, you have the large scale, the working class. However, there was no class politics almost in the sense of the 20th century. So this is another kind of the paradox of that. And the political party itself transformed largely. We are, in terms of the so-called three represents raised by President Jiang Zemin, that is a party must always represent the requirements of the development of China's advanced productive forces, the orientation of development of China's advanced culture, and the fundamental interests, not direct, of the overwhelming majority of the people in China. As a consequence, the working class is no longer represented in the political sphere in that sense. It's very different, it's transformed. And the public policy is thus inevitably inclined for a certain period, especially in the 1990s and the first decade in the new century, to the favored interest of capital. On these conditions, whether in the socialist systems and of the social democratic systems, and the political forms have been decoupled from the social form. So these are Gini coefficient is now to 0.476. It's higher than the average number of the OECD countries. So that was, on the one hand, you have the Communist Party in the leadership, but still the level of the social equality was not reached that high as claimed that. The third is a political democracy as a system that operates within the confines of the nation state and is based on the rights of the citizens, has had a hard time coping with these novel global challenges. That's also the same in China, not only in America, because the financial crisis, especially the financial sectors, was really go beyond the borders of that. So these are a lot of the changes for that. And these delinking of the democratic system from its associated social forms is characteristic of many countries in transformation. Under the influence of neoliberalism, the weakening of the public ownership and the social welfare under the socialism has gone hand in hand with privatization. In terms, actually, it's not privatization, it's a denationalization. It's mainly market orientation and the globalization. These gulf between the rich and the poor, the contrast between the city and the countryside, uneven development of regions, and the last but not least, the ecological crisis all ultimately hinge on the relations between the labor and the capital under the current conditions of production. So that's, but what these are the general conditions transformed, what happened in the political sphere? Let me summarize that, the arguments laid out above. In the aftermath of the Cold War, democratic political system didn't undergo any significant formal changes. Yet democracy at the social level is in crisis everywhere, in different forms. In China, which still maintains the socialist system, while the system and the form of government has also not undergone fundamental change. Society has been so powerfully transformed that there was a constant discussion about just what kind of the society it is. While most commentators trace the divergence between China and those democracies back to the differences in their political systems, I'm of the opinion that at its core, the current political crisis stems from the separation of the political system from the social form. The crisis in political legitimation is the consequence of the breakdown of the representation within the political system, that is a separation of the political and the social. Because you claim that if you read the Constitution, you still have that kind of the representation, but in the social form transformed in different ways of that. So the decline of the representation in the contemporary politics is a result of a unique multi-layered political crisis. I think that is one of that was the crisis or the transformation of political party or the political parties. Because we used to describe the China and other socialist countries as a party state. But I prefer to use that the state party rather than the party state. Because generally speaking, the party integrated into the framework of the state became the state apparatus rather than the political organization. So it's difficult to raise the issue, political issue and the values. So that was the contradiction. I think there's still the contradiction ongoing because some people were trying to follow in the certain kind of the way orientation, and some were trying to back to like the end of the 1980s and so on and so forth. So that is still an ongoing process. So thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, let me be the fourth person to thank Nicola for inviting us here to talk about, or maybe play with his questions, which are perhaps unanswerable, at least speaking for myself. It's important questions, really crucial for the world, I think, and yet hard to answer at this point in time, not only because of the sense of crisis Wang Hui was just discussing, but also it seems to me we're in a strange moment of sort of stillness, waiting for something to happen. But anyways, let me say a few words about democracy and citizenship in China. And in good sinological fashion, I'd like to begin with some ancient references. So from probably the 4th century BCE, we have this. When the people are weak, the kingdom is strong. When the people are strong, the kingdom is weak. Hence, the kingdom that possesses the way devotes itself to weakening the people. So that's from the legalist text, the Book of Lord Shan. Then there's something like the opposite view of Mencius, perhaps a generation or two later. Mencius said to King Xuan, when all of your immediate ministers say the demand is worthy, it is not sufficient. When all of your great officers say so, it is not sufficient. But when all of your people say so, look into the case, and if you find him to be worthy, then employ him. Since Mencius further legitimated dynastic change, the killing of evil emperors, he was regarded as justifying revolution. But interestingly, the legalist view, highly autocratic, might imply a greater potential for the people to exercise agency than does the milder Mencius view, although it's Mencius whom early 20th century Chinese intellectuals turned to find a sort of proto-democratic ancestor. So really, I want to begin with Liang Qichao. Here, at about the turn of the 20th century, he wrote extensively about the links between citizenship and democracy, premised on the idea of the nation state. He wrote about constitutions and parliaments, and overall kept looking at Britain's constitutional monarchy as a model China should try to emulate. There was some egalitarian idealism in Liang's thought as well, but equally the British example was to offer lessons in how to achieve wealth and power in a more utilitarian and even statist framework. Putting all that aside, the core of Liang's vision was the notion of democracy as political participation. I want to point to the term Liang generally used for what I think covers the concept of democracy. That is Mingquan, which perhaps best back translates to popular power or powers of the people. Then the question, of course, is what Liang meant by the people. On the one hand, the people included any person, man or woman, who could be defined as Chinese and was also knowledgeable enough to participate in public affairs. On the other hand, while this category included more than the old gentry and school graduates, it would seem to leave out the majority of illiterate Chinese at the time. That said, it was an inclusive ideal as an ideal, and based on the idea that all people had the potential capacity to function as citizens. Another key term for Liang was that of gong, or public. That is, he insisted that the state was public, as opposed to belonging to the space of the private. So this was his attack on the emperorship as resting on the idea that the imperial family had privatized the realm. I think it's fair to say, at an extreme level of generalization, that over the first half of the 20th century, China's rural society largely stagnated, while urban growth and involvement in global economic flows created a de facto citizenry, groups demanding political rights, including women, students, and workers. For their part, intellectuals looked to the state to create a populace that would be active but disciplined. So that was a task central to the state building of the nationalists in the 1920s and 30s and the communists ever since. There was nothing unique about the Chinese state taking on this role, although the party state, if you'll allow me to use the term party state, the party state ruling structure left little room for institutions of liberal democracy. It was Taiwan that began to deconstruct the party state and build a free press and universal suffrage in the 1980s. In China, the definition of the people underwent several changes. In his 1941 essay on New Democracy, Mao Zedong essentially included everyone who was an anti-Japanese patriot and foresaw a role for capitalists in the early stages of building socialism. This is still reflected in the national flag, with its 5 stars representing the Communist Party, plus the 4 classes of workers, peasants, petty bourgeoisie, and the national bourgeoisie. By the early 1950s, as class labels were routinized and even inheritable, rural landlords and urban capitalists became enemies of the people, not included in the category of the people. A language was thus developed to indicate different relationships to the state. Citizen, gongmin, did include just about everybody, but that did not guarantee any rights. The people, renmin, or sometimes masses, minzhong, on the other hand, indicated groups considered more reliable or pliant by the party state, that is, workers and peasants. The dichotomy has since broken down, as we've just been hearing, but not so far in any way that threatens the supremacy of the party state. If we look at China's constitution, we see in Articles 1 through 3 several references to principles that are maybe in some tension with one another. First, that the country, I quote, is a socialist state governed by a people's democratic dictatorship that is led by the working class and based on an alliance of workers and peasants, sort of all of the 1930s. Leadership by the Communist Party of China is the defining feature of socialism with Chinese characteristics. It is prohibited for any organization or individual to damage the socialist system. This is from the 1980s. While second, the Constitution goes on, all power in the People's Republic of China belongs to the people. And third, that state institutions of the People's Republic of China shall practice the principle of democratic centralism, or in political science terms, effectively selectocracy. Although the party has explicitly admitted capitalists as members since the first years of this century, that is, the 3 represents, and in spite of guarantees of human rights in the Constitution, this constitutional language overall not only mandates supremacy of the Communist Party, but suggests that one of the state's main roles remains disciplinary. Coming back to Nicola's dichotomies then, I see China as fundamentally not a cultural state, nor a civilizational state, but engaged in a top-down process devoted to the construction of a nation-state. This is a process that has long marked Chinese modernity and possibly defines it. It remains to be seen whether in the future China's citizens will become more active participants in civic life, perhaps more active than citizens of liberal democracies who do little more than take themselves to the polls every 4th year. If that sounds weirdly optimistic, there are resources in the political culture, including from the Maoist era, that might make it possible. I do realize that, as widely pointed out, and we've been hearing already, democracy now seems to be on the retreat globally. In China, Xi Jinping's attacks on civil society and his policies of a forced assimilation are more than well documented. So I'm fairly sure we won't be seeing a global democratic revolution in 2024, but you never know when events will conspire to make the idea of new beginnings suddenly seem possible again. The political dysfunction of so much of the world today, the failures, if you like, of both socialism and liberalism, might be leading to such a future. Coming back to China, the philosopher Tzu Jiwei has recently proposed that in certain ways, Chinese society is already democratic, with the development of a sphere for private life since the Cultural Revolution and a social ethic that is broadly egalitarian. He then suggests that the party state is heading toward a legitimacy crisis. Neither repressive measures nor the ideological state apparatus can provide the government with legitimacy in the long run, given the evolution of Chinese society. Only a democratic polity that matches the approximately democratic society can do so. The political theorist Liu Qing has built a similar argument for liberalism as rooted in China's historical experience, not least because contemporary society is pluralistic in at least many respects. We have seen in China the ratcheting up of repression and bizarrely contrived ideological proclamations. To me, this suggests that China's leaders are wrestling with the problem of legitimacy. It is difficult to imagine Chinese politics as doing more than stagnating as long as Xi Jinping remains in power. But the prospects for a degree of democratization after he is gone, however we define democratization, these prospects should not be dismissed. Least of all, in an America suffering from increasingly hysterical xenophobia. Thank you.
Well, let me thank our speakers again. As expected, we have heard from very different perspectives, very different point of view. I find it particularly interesting this question of general political crises that are reverberating in different societies, the divergences and the asymmetries that have developed over time, certainly since the end of the Cold War, between political society, the political sphere and social spheres, also political society, civil societies, crisis of legitimacy, and so forth. And how all of these discussions, let's say, affect our idea of democracy and political systems and so forth. So in the remaining few minutes, I would like to ask our speakers if they want to add very briefly some comments to what has been said, 2 or 3 minutes, and then we will open the floor for questions. Lydia.
I mentioned how difficult it is to discuss democracy in this context at this juncture. And therefore, we can't start from definitions or genealogies. And I think it's very important to look at what is going on the ground. And therefore, I think I thought what is so interesting is to look at the social sphere and see what space is becoming politicized. I mean, it's not a given that is the political space is, you find in the relation between state and individual, in the operations of the party, and I think it's very important to look elsewhere
and be imaginative about the space of political engagement. So that was the point I wanted to make.
Is this on as well? Just to follow up briefly on the sort of the interconnectedness of these global crises and how they are not just political, but also economic crises. I mean, it is interesting to me to think about how we're dealing with a crisis of the working class, both in the West and in China. With the globalization, the problem is the working class in the West has no work, and the people in China are overworked, right? You know, the way, capital and labor and all the production happens in China. And I'm really struck how in China, then, workers have gone from constituting a privileged political class, might have been poor, but privileged, just kind of economic class, the kind of run-of-the-mill industrial proletariat. And it's just so ironic because, of course, the economic reform started in 1978. They were premised on the idea that the class struggle had been won in the main, time to move beyond the Cultural Revolution. And that's what made these reforms possible, which for the first time created an actual economic class in the kind of, in a sense of an industrial proletariat. But because the vocabulary of class has been retired from the official lexicon, there's really no official political vocabulary to address it. So it's just kind of sadly ironic.
Okay, let me add something for the transformation of the political systems and the forms. I try to give a further explanation a little bit about the so-called from the party state to the state party. Because basically, even now, the party emphasizes very strongly about its function of the ideological function. They try to elaborate the ideological values. But actually, if you look at the function in the everyday life, it's more or less work as a state apparatus. And not only this, but directly party became the more administrative power rather than the political organization. So that was the huge transformation in China. And there were different judgments on that. Some people well thought that was a possibility for the next step for the constitutional change because it's a more legal, can be for the legal society and so on and so forth. But some people will recall the early dynamic of the social movements in the whole 20th century, how that the movements achieved a certain kind of the rights of equality. So that was the different kind of the judgments that also triggered huge debate in China. That when I was the editor of Dushu magazine, we already had a huge debate on these kind of the issues. Now there was a more censorship. However, in the social media, you can still see the different orientations come from each other. So this is the add some.
I'm not a close student of contemporary China, but it seems to me, following these remarks, we can also see a growing gap between official ideology and the real life of most Chinese people, as well as the sort of very difficult and complex mixing of the realms that Lydia has spoken of in terms of social action and practice on the one hand, what I would say on the one hand, and then the political realities on the other. So if we look at a sort of the feminist movement or movements plural, there are many actors, some of whom are incredibly brave, while at the same time, the state has been taking steps in just the past months, cracking down on some of the demonstrations in some cases, or the increasing number, I believe the ratio of women trying to divorce their husbands and having those divorces granted has been going down. So these tensions seem to me both socially and ideologically are increasing.
Well, thank you very much. I mean, I think that remark made by Lydia about the politicization or the opening up of political spaces within society is very important. We've seen it also during the COVID-19 crisis, I think, where protests happen spontaneously in China. So you've heard a variety of opinion. And we still have about 20 minutes that we wanted to reserve for questions from the audience. And there are microphones here. If you can raise your hand, I will. Yes, there is a question right there. Just wait for the microphone and then.
I'm a former political science professor who had the good fortune to work at several foundations and to travel largely in Africa, but also in Europe. And the question that as I try to survey a little bit, find out what's happened, is the end of ideology or end of ideology period with the decline of the Soviet Union, the end of ideology in Asia, because the countries of Asia fear China and don't want to follow that path, but an imprint, not of Chinese ideology, but the organizational infrastructure that China has is, I think, from what I just picked up, being replicated in African countries. And there are 51 countries in Africa, or at least there were. And I'm not speaking of all of them, but many significant countries, not Nigeria, but in other parts of the African continent, the Chinese infrastructure is being utilized to organize political power. And I can't say that it is working operationally, but I can say that it exists in some form, I'm not quite sure how yet, as a model that has an imprint in African political thought. And recognizing that political thought, like other forms of political thought, socialism, communism, are gone in a certain sense. But that raises fundamental questions, I think, about the character of democracy, not only in China, but outside of China, in Africa and Latin America. Where are we in our political thought? Or let's put it this way, where is democratic political thought in a post-socialist era, post-communist era? Thank you.
That was a great question about infrastructure that China built in African countries. I don't study that, but I'm aware of a lot of public spaces that China built in various countries, and these spaces are often criticized in the media. Hospitals, schools, and sports spaces, and but you suggested that these could become spaces for reinventing political thought. That didn't occur to me, and I wonder how that might happen. I could imagine it it could happen, but I haven't read anything that really specifies exactly how new political thought emerged out of these new spaces. But I'm very curious about that.
And I'll just add something. I mean, let's go to the post-ideological moment. I think China's involvement in Africa in the 60s, for example, was very different. It was involved in a lot of kind of a socialist fraternal development projects, you know, and then I think there was a real ideological connection. I think Qingquan Li, who was formerly a member of the Institute for Advanced Studies some years ago, a recent book, the title of which I can't remember, Qingquan Li. She studied actually different forms of Chinese capital in Africa, and she distinguishes between Chinese state capital and private Chinese capital, and she finds that they behave differently. Also, and what the results are depends a lot on the existing infrastructure in a particular African state, to what extent it is in a position to negotiate with China or not. But I think what almost all African countries do appreciate about China, even to the extent, not always, but often, even if it's projects that's in some ways neo-colonial, China does not, at least overtly, try to, you know, import or export, rather export its ideology, right? In that sense, it is non-ideological, unlike, let's say, World Bank projects, which insist you must have democracy and rule of law, blah, blah, blah. So I think that is a salient difference.
Thank you for your question. We have another question here and then one here. Please do say your name and
Jeff Laurenti. Peter Zaro had made a very tantalizing reference to an alternative Chinese development of democracy and citizenship on that one little shard of China that has eluded CCP rule, Taiwan. And I wonder to what extent people in China see that as a different model, as one that is equally democratic or equally citizen-centered or different, and how people in those autonomous regions of the People's Republic, thinking Inner Mongolia, Xinjiang, and Tibet, see themselves as enjoying a democratic possibility as citizens of the People's Republic, and to what extent they think it's a hoax.
Well, certainly, generally speaking, the Taiwanese people are extremely proud of the development of democratic institutions and practices over the last, I guess, 40 or 50 years. And it sort of gets incorporated into a sense of identity. So it's my impression that more and more people in China are sort of interested in this and following it through social media. But I have no specific information on that part of your question.
Concerning the Taiwan democracy, I think that the opinion is divided. The one is that certain kind of admiration, but not only the political developments, but also the economic and the social developments in Taiwan that since the 70s and of that high developments. But on the other hand, that in East Asia, we always feel that all these developments are under the shadows of the big powers. So it's not possible for any other or not followers of that big powers. You can do the same thing. So in that sense, you have the double perceptions on that development. So that's not only, I think, in the Taiwan, but also there's a certain kind of the geopolitical continuation of that Cold War or the new tensions for that. That will give the possibility for that. And concerning that the autonomous regions, I think this is a big issue that we know that the last decades in Tibet, in the Xinjiang, a lot of the crises happened. And the the backgrounds and the conditions are very complicated, both domestic and the international. Mainly, I think that the transformation of the autonomous region system itself, it's into the whole market relations that made old arrangements that useless to some extent. Before that, it was still capable to cover the certain kind of the social welfare systems, and together with the very ideological at that time, the high so-called respect of the minorities and so on and so forth. But obviously, in these were transformations since the 1990s, that kind of the relations transformed, created the new tensions here and there. But these were not necessarily directly influence the identity of as a citizen, but try to rethink about how that the ethnic relations were translated into the class relations, or the class relations were retranslated into the ethnic inequality. So that gave the social economic transformation, gave some stimulate that the radical developments of the identity politics there. So.
I will just add in relation to this last point, just very briefly, that if we consider the transition of China from an empire to a nation state, certainly those, let's say, frontier regions show the most dramatic transformation in terms of how central power related to these regions. So during the Qing dynasty, I think it's everybody would agree, there was an accepted concept, principle of cultural, religious, linguistic pluralism in all of these regions that was pretty much embedded in the conception of an empire, in the fabric of what it meant to be an empire. And that certainly changed over time in different phases, including during the Republican period, not just the communist period. And I take that as one of the most visible transformation of this place from being an empire to being a nation. Yes.
My name is Ken Wu. I am a retired aerospace engineer from Lockheed Martin. I sense you all have difficulty defining democracy. I think that is normal. That is nature. So my question to you is, do you think in nature, the nature care about justice, the nature care about democracy? Is there inequality, poverty, all those terms we human beings created? That's my question.
Well, it seems more like a rhetorical question. I can say perhaps you are right. I mean, these are all terms subject to definition. Sometimes they're difficult to define. But anybody wants to comment? Yes, Lydia.
If you really wanted to go that route, we don't have the time to do that. If you think about the Chinese term 民主, which is used to translate democracy. So we think of these as equivalent terms. But in fact, in the 19th century, 民主 was introduced into Chinese through the translation of an international law text in 1864. It was used to translate, it's very interesting, to translate a republic Yes, but then later became a republic, acquired a different Chinese translation. So in the translation of international law in 1864, 民主 was translated against 君主, which is monarchy. So it was not 民主 opposed to authoritarianism. See what I mean? The semantics has transformed. If you really take it seriously, 民主 is not a Chinese term, although in the ancient text, you could see people rule, 民主, that was a very different term. But it is related to geopolitics even back then in the 19th century. So it's not a question of definition. It is a process of translation, interpretation, and understanding. So that's my answer.
Yeah, just quickly.
And then it becomes the Chinese term.
The reason,
It becomes a Chinese term through the Japanese intervention, because the Japanese then took the international text, international law translation to Japan during the Meiji reform, right? And they reshuffled the term. So then 共和, they made 共和 a Chinese translation of republic, and the 民主 translation. So there was this discursive circulation that created this term, which we think can be transparent and self-evident, which is not, because it has its own history.
yeah, I am not talking about translation. I'm talking about nature, the beauty of nature. The nature is a huge system. It has energy and it has boundary condition. When you put in different energy in a confined environment, it will come to a solution that you cannot expect. There is no way we can expect. And that is what we see, different form of so-called democracy. It's a different form. Nature will always seek all kinds of solution. That is normal.
Thank you very much. We have a question over there, and then we have a question here. Maybe, and Wendy Brown. So, yeah, the microphone is coming.
So I can't resist responding to that. I'm Scott Pothig. I'm a biologist at the University of Pennsylvania, plant biologist. So I think what you're basically saying is that we're all animals, which we are, and that we can define things in different ways, but at the end of the day, we're going to act like animals. And so you can remove all the definitions and whatever, take away all the political structure. At the end of the day, we're going to eat, we're going to have sex, end of story. And eventually, society, according to your analogy here, will descend to what our brethren in the forest do. And we've just created this complicated system that we all worry about and talk about. I happen to believe that these discussions are valuable, but but it is true, fundamentally, we're animals, and it's worth thinking about that because many of our interactions are at that level, instinctual, and it's worth keeping that in mind.
Thank you very much. I think we have a question from Wendy Brown and then Joseph here, and then we will close.
Okay. First, I just want to say, Lydia, I so appreciated your formulation through the video of a democratic eruption without democratic institutions and a democratic state. It's such an important reminder that democracy often doesn't live in states. States may be useful for other things, but that's not where democracy lives. And it's a very important reminder to the West and to liberal Democrats. But also it goes to the question I want to ask, which is to Wang Hui about this idea that the crisis today, East and West, I think you're saying, has to do with a coming apart of the social and the political. And it seemed to me what Lydia was doing was reminding us that democratic eruptions often are social eruptions that may have a political voice and a political aim, a political set of characteristics, but when they get fully adopted into states, they're generally neutered and tamed and neutralized, which is why I say states are not necessarily the holding place for democracy. And I thought that was what was so wonderful about the whole thing. But what I'm perplexed by is this idea that the coming apart of the social and political is recent. It seems to me absolutely endemic to European modernity. It's really the essence of the state that can declare itself democratic in a class society, not to mention a gendered society, racialized society, and so forth. So I would love to hear just a little more about what you're thinking in this idea that the coming apart of the social and political is the democratic crisis and the democratic predicament, as it were, for China as well as the West, when it seems to me endemic rather than recent.
The question is for you.
Thank you. This is a very important and not easy answer for this. I try to answer this from more historical perspective first. Yes, all these kind of discussions, like even the social protest, eventually will reach to the like a policy level. So eventually became the matters of the state. But people in Chinese cases look back to the 20th century experience. I think that one of the speciality were early during the Chinese political system really took the shape during the wartime. That I mean, the CCPs, the PRC, the movements was really from the wartime. What we labeled as so-called the People's War at that time. The so-called People's War was not only the military, but it's a combination of the political party politics, military politics, land reform politics, social self-organization like a peasants' union, women's union, even children's the organization, and together for dealing with the everyday life for that. So in that sense, there were double sides of that, the moments, like communist moments in the 20th century in China. On the one hand, it was a moment, it's a kind of the campaign for like a superpower, like a super party, because they don't want to share the power with others. But on the other hand, there was some kind of beyond the party politics. It's together with the social movements, certain kind. So that's why the people at that time, in the most dynamic moment, it was a kind of not only the political moment, but also the social movements. So that's why a lot of the organization. Put back to the 1960s to before the reform. It's interesting, you also mentioned that the constitutional issue. And you know that, and also our poster, the picture was the Xidan Democracy Wall. How to read that, the image from the Chinese perspective, especially like Deng Xiaoping, how to read it. It's interesting because during the Cultural Revolution, because before the Cultural Revolution, when Mao and a lot of thought that the high bureaucratization of that revolutionary regime already, so you need to get rid of that. So they argue for the so-called big democracy. So big democracy means that speak out loudly, held the views fully, and write the big character poster, and also organize the big debates together. So in the 1974, that kind of experience that came from the early stage of the People's War were written into the 1974 version of Constitution. That banished, that banned after the Cultural Revolution, that thought that was that kind of the bigger democracy could be the starting point of the Cultural Revolution. So the negation of the Cultural Revolution started from the change of that the certain articles from that the radical constitution in the 70s. So that's interesting. When we read the Xidan Minzhuqiang, that the poster, the war in the end of the 70s, early 80s it's a symbol, a symbolic, the monuments for the democratic movements. But from the government and from the Deng Xiaoping especially, the party's perspective, that was the return to the beginning of the Cultural Revolution. So that's why they read that as a kind of the anarchism. So that's what trying to change. But through this complicated story, we can understand that how complicated that the social, that legacy of the early democratic legacy was so different dimensions. That's why the people, some people will argue that we still, though after the negation of Cultural Revolution, we still think about the certain kind of the moments, the organization, the social moments, together with the political change. That was why that constituted a huge debates in China, because once you talk about that related to the Cultural Revolution, this is another hot topic for the debates for that. But in that sense, you can see that the very specific experience to think about the relationship between the political and the social.
I'd like to add another historical note before maybe Lydia has something to say. But so historically, by the end of the 19th century, the Chinese state was extraordinarily weak and was seen as very weak. So the task is to, and also by the early 20th century, new concepts of society come to the fore with the sort of solution for China's problems resting on the need to strengthen the state. Then I'm almost tempted to say in Maoism, there is no such thing as society, almost sort of like Margaret Thatcher, but from the other angle. And in the Cultural Revolution, you come very close to the real abolition of society, but that then unravels by the end of the 1960s, and you have deliberate policies of depoliticization and the reemergence of society with various potentials that begin to act in ways that I think both Wang Hui and Lydia Liu described.
One last question here, and then we have.
Well, thank you. It's been a fascinating discussion beyond the simplifications we deal with in our media. So I have a very specific question. One view of liberal democracy is supervised local and regional elections. Aside from what's happening at the central level in China, what has been the evolution, ups and downs or downs and ups, of support and actuality of supervised local and regional elections in China? Thank you.
I think the answer is probably very varied depending where you are. So I can't really speak on that specific level. So I don't know if other folks have more specific observations.
Currently, well, that situation has changed. The whole idea of full process people's democracy treats elections as one stage. And there are local elections depending on, village level, but certainly you hear criticisms, these elections don't matter that much. But I think the full process people's democracy tries to work that out. That is, elections are not that central. And this goes back to what Peter was saying, that the idea of people, what exactly are they doing with that idea? I think earlier when Wendy asked, really help bring to light, really the theoretical problem here. So the political, if we don't locate the political in the elections in China or elsewhere, then the political, where do we look and find it? So that's the whole thing. I think it takes a lot of work to identify that space. In many decades ago, feminists would say the personal is the political. And it didn't used to be seen that way. So there are many spaces that where things could happen. It's just we're not prepared. And we're weighed down by our usual conceptions of political in terms of you know, the constitution, you know, the state, and the legal, and all of these. So that's usually where we look. What about the everyday? What about the QR code? I'm just using that as an allegory. What about all of these things that, you know, in daily life, people's participation in socioeconomic life, where the political is happening, but we're not looking there, so we don't know.
Can I also just add one more comment to Wendy's question? I mean, I completely agree. The state is always a structure of coercion, and there's always a gap between the political, economic, and social. But I think there is a crisis of legitimacy, if you will, in China, to the extent that a successful state is one where the ideology is able to suture that gap more or less, and where there's more or less buy-in. And I think there's a big gap in terms of kind of like the organization of private desire, where there's a lot of freedom, versus the political organization, and there's no longer an ideology that successfully bridges that gap. So I think that's why you have there's increase on these alternative venues and alternative ways in which the political occurs.
I would like to say that, of course, this doesn't exhaust the conversation by any means. It's just a way to perhaps have a moment of reflection on what this means. We haven't even spoken about Hong Kong, for instance. But I would like to thank all of you for coming to this roundtable panel discussion, and I would like to thank our speakers for contributing their ideas.